Karl, how are you doing? Thank you so much for being here, sir.
My pleasure, Dr. Brian. Lovely to be with you. Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com. My name's Karl Kruslinski. I'd like to think of myself as Lord Master of Time and Space, but I don't get any credit, so I'm just plain old Karl. And I do all sorts of sciencey talk. So I've written 45 books. I do about 8 radio shows around the world doing science talkback. And I have 28 years of free education because back then Australia thought that education was a worthwhile investment in the future. We still have a few countries that do free education. So in my case, my free education starts off in baby jail, goes through kindergarten, primary school and high school, and then goes to university where I've got 16 years of free education with degrees in physics and mathematics, a master's degree in biomedical engineering when I designed and built a machine to pick up electrical signals off the human retina, degree in medicine and a degree in surgery. And I've worked in all of those fields. I've worked as a physicist and mathematician. I've worked as an engineer. I've worked as a doctor in the kids' hospital. And I also have a few years for free again of non-degree education at the university level in computer science, astrophysics, electrical engineering and philosophy, just to round me off. But I get my real education by reading my way through $10,000 worth of scientific literature every year, which is a pile about a metre thick every month. And then to make it stick in my head, well, it doesn't stick unless you do something with it. And what I have to do is write 4 stories every week, or at least write 1 story. So the stories actually make it stick in your head. And so people can ring up and say, well, what happens to all the rubber that ends up coming off tires on a road? And because I wrote a story about that in book number 24, I can kind of remember it. But if I don't write a story on it, well, there's just this sort of knowledge that gets all confused up. So the height of Mount Everest is 24 cubic meters per square second per month, I think. And everything just goes into a real mess.
I've heard a lot of people say that. The best way to learn a subject is to write a book about it.
Or at least a story. Well, I'll give you an example. Suppose I were to give you 1,000 words in alphabetical order and say, oh, by the way, the Dr. Brian, the reason I call everybody doctor on the shows is because people kept on saying, look, I feel like this is a stupid question and I shouldn't be asking it. And I was, and still am, in the School of Physics. I've just been recently introduced there. And I said, look, we've got all of these academics. Everyone's a doctor. Many of them are professors. And we're sitting around having morning tea. And they'll ask each other questions. And I think, I know the answer to that, but they don't. And that made me think that, firstly, we all have different areas of ignorance. And secondly, if you ask a question, you might be ignorant for a second in somebody's eyes. But if you don't ask it, you'll be ignorant in your own eyes forever because you'll never know the answer. So in an effort to make people feel not embarrassed about asking questions, I call them doctor. And I'm not trying to take away from people who are a real doctor who've done a PhD for 3 to 8 years, you know. And in fact, I'm not a real doctor either under the university system, because in the university system, the only way you get to be a real doctor is to have a PhD, and my highest degree is a master's. So I've got an honorary degree called doctor, as in medical. So medical people have been called doctor going back to the 1400s in England, when a doctor was somebody with an amount of expertise in a certain area. Anyway, so that's it. So Dr. Brian, getting back to the remembering stories, you right with that? Okay, here we go. So if I, yeah, go on.
Well, so wait, you say in Australia, and do you have an MD, the same degree we have that medical doctors have in the US?
Yes and no. So it's equivalent to an MD, but what we have is something called an MBBS, Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery. There is a degree called an MD, but it's like a PhD, but where a medical doctor does a PhD. So, but we have the equivalent, yeah. Okay, so anyway, getting back to remembering stuff by writing stories. Okay, so Dr. Brian, if I give you 1,000 words in alphabetical order and say, hey, give them back to me, you might get back a dozen or 2 or something. But if I tell it to you as a story, whole different ballpark. So here comes the story. The other morning I woke up a bit early and there was knocking on the door, and I went down there, and who was there but Kim Kardashian? He said, hey, Karl, I want you and your wife to come with me to the airport. We're going on a surprise. So we go in her limo to the airport, and then we fly all the way to Washington, D.C., where we end up having a nude mud bath with Donald Trump. And it turns out that he, like all the other world leaders, are actually shape-changing reptilians from the planet Zog. Now, most of what I just told you, you can tell me back
Yeah.
because that was a story.
Right.
So therefore, I have a theory, but I haven't proven it. I haven't found anything on it. That the human brain is wired up to remember stories as part of our sticking together as a group. Because when you think about us as a fighting animal, well, our claws, our fingernails are pretty pathetic. Our teeth aren't as good as a dog's teeth at ripping your neck out. We can kind of run you down in a marathon, but we're not really good at sprinting. Really, we don't have much going for us except our brain. And part of the being together as a group are all these little rituals that we have to bring in group cohesiveness. And so there's a theory, it hasn't been proven. How can you prove it? There's a theory or a hypothesis that we all yawn to show group cohesiveness. And the storytellers have long had an honorable and respected position because they help bring maybe, I don't know, I'm guessing that they bring the group together. Either way, your brain is wired up to tell a story where it's not to give back the same words in random order. And so that's the third part of getting knowledge together to turn into stories with the beginning and a middle and an end. Wow, that was a long discussion. What was the question again?
Yeah, I agree completely. I've got one of the live talks that I give is about we make everyone in the room's brain fail a whole bunch of times, and that's by forcing people's brains to do the things that it's terrible at, which is things exactly what you're talking about. Remembering a list of words or a list of numbers, things like that. Really, the brain is great at learning ideas and expressing ideas, but not the individual nuts and bolts and components of those ideas. We're terrible at collecting data. We're great at collecting ideas. So, I mean, your story idea is very much in the same. In fact, your example that you gave me about the organizing the list of words in a story, I can come back right now and say Kardashian, limo, airport, Washington, D.C., Trump, hot tub. And I just, right there's a bunch of words from your story. Now, if 5 minutes ago you had simply related a list of words, I wouldn't have been able to remember that many of them. So I did better at a task that a brain is not good at by putting it into the format of a task that the brain is good at, remembering an idea, story instead of a list of data.
And that's one thing I like about the human brain working together with computers, because they have different skills from us. So in terms of airlines, I like the idea of a computer just keeping an eye on all of the boring engine and flight parameters to make sure that none of them goes out of spec. But when something goes wrong, and you got to think outside the box, to use that dumb cliche, hey, that's when you really need a human in the loop. And the example is landing an Airbus 380 with a blown engine at Singapore airport with a full load of fuel and a couple of hundred passengers. It'd be interesting to see how good we get at the human brain interface. And I think that's going to take a lot longer than we thought, because even getting a computer to read what you're thinking, and then if you're a paralyzed person inside a exoskeleton, to make you kick a soccer ball, well, that's really, really hard, because there's all sorts of noise coming out of the brain, and you got to pick out the tiny little signal buried in a noise that says left foot, then right foot, then lean onto the left hip, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I am hanging out. Do you read Alastair Reynolds, the science fiction writer?
No, I have not.
No, oh, he's great fun. He does space opera where, we cover solar systems and occasionally into the galaxy, and then maybe even another galaxy, and there's the human race in the future sometime. And he talks about the concept that there are, further down the line, and I've been reading science fiction for bloody decades, of people who have memory chips in their brains for remembering everything accurately, and then little quantum computers buried in their brains to enhance them. And the two of them, the human brain and the quantum brain, which has its own intelligence, work together as a seamless unit. But of course, that becomes obsolete when you follow the example of Freeman Dyson, who was at the Santa Fe Institute, where our car blew up when we were trying to follow Route 66 in a 55 Chev. Mate, he came up.
You've told me that story before, yes.
Yeah. So the proper shape for a human being is a cloud of iron vapor weighing 50 kilograms, the diameter of a planet floating through space on magnetic fields, and effectively immortal. And you're thinking, well, is it human? And as far as I'm concerned, what makes you human is not your skin color or religion or how many arms and legs you've got, or even if you're based on carbon. But if you and I can have a conversation, well, you're my mate. You're one of us. And then you ask the big question, the big important one: what about sex? Well, luckily, that deep philosopher and person who sued the Queen of England, Frank Zappa, he came up with the answer to that. Your brain is your main sexual organ.
Well, let me ask you a question about this.
Yeah,
so when you're talking about the brain-computer interface and enhancing our brain's abilities by adding the capabilities that it's not good at, letting a computer take over those for us, I mean, that's basically having a smartphone. So 25 years ago, I knew a lot of phone numbers. Today, I don't know any phone numbers. Probably literally not a single phone number do I have in my brain, because I don't need to anymore, because I have this. So my question for you would be, have I lost some of the ability to learn phone numbers? And have I gained an ability to think in more abstract terms since I haven't been having to think about phone numbers? Has my brain changed what it's good at?
I reckon your brain has changed. I don't think you've permanently lost it. I think you've chosen not to exercise it. So, for example, in our society, we all have to pay tax. And for wealthy people, that's an option, and they choose not to exercise that option. And so in the case of Arnold Schwarzenegger, he gets his muscles by pumping iron. And so you're building some metaphorical muscles in your brain by learning new skills, and you've lost some others, and you can get them back. So I do a lot of radio work, and occasionally I get called in to just do commercial radio and other sorts of radio stations where they get me on to do a little interview as opposed to my normal Q&A. And this is quite astonishing, on 3 separate occasions, after I've done my little spot on air with the host, the producer has called me aside and said, look, Karl, I think there's something wrong with me. I can't concentrate anymore. And then we go down a pathway, and it turns out that a typical example is when they're at home with their family, friends, and they want to just relax and watch TV, they can't do that. They're watching TV with their special friend for 2 minutes or 1 minute, and then suddenly they have to look at their smartphone, and they have to look at this and have to look at everything. And it's as though they're wanting that constant input of diverse information. And in the jobs that these radio people have, for a 3 to 4 hour window every day, they're just full on picking up information that's coming in from the audience as well as off the news feed, not doing any deep analysis, and then immediately making a very quick summary, and maybe adding that summary in writing for the host, who's the jock who's on air, and then going on to the next one and the next one. And not a single thing is done in depth. And this worried me with the first one, and I came up with some advice which works for the other two, which is when you go on holidays, do not take your phone with you. Take a book that you remember reading as a kid and that you liked, and then try and read it. And all of them said, I can't read a book. I mean, they get to page 1.5 and that's it. They've got to do something else. So they're on holiday somewhere. And then normally by about day 7, they can actually begin to read the book. And by about day 8 or 9, they can actually read the whole book. And suddenly their brain has now exercising a different part, which has been allowed to lie lazy. So in your case, Brian, with not remembering phone numbers, you could do it again. But I think there's one reason for it, and that is the dreaded EMP. If we had, say, 2 nuclear weapons going off in the atmosphere, so not affecting humans directly, but 2 nuclear weapons above America between 40 and 400 kilometers up, and say 2 across Europe and each continent, and maybe 4 or 5 across Asia and Russia, and a couple across Africa, that would pretty well destroy 95% of all communications and electrical grids across the world. And that would be a terrible, terrible thing. And then among other things, besides getting food and water, you'd have to remember phone numbers, but of course your phone wouldn't work, so what the heck?
Yeah. Yeah, I love how in movies, an EMP is always temporary. It knocks out all the computers for 30 seconds or something, just enough time for the hero to run down the hall and get through the locked door or something. It really doesn't accurately state how and why that happens. I mean, it's literally an EMP is literally a giant wave of electrons rushing through the circuitry and burning it up, permanently destroying.
Yeah, EMP, electromagnetic pulse, first noticed, I think, around 1965, where with one of their very last atmospheric tests, the USA put a nuke on a rocket and did a test called Starfish Prime. And it went, I forget how high up in the atmosphere, but somewhere between 40 and 400 kilometers up from the Marshall Islands, and 1,600 kilometers away in Hawaii, with the primitive electronics that they had there, big rugged things with valves and big solid separate transistors. A whole lot of circuitry fell over and garage doors opened and closed, and that scared the heck out of everybody. And now with our electronic equipment being running at such much lower sensitivity levels, it would just wipe everything. Now, something like 95% of all the money on the planet does not exist as a physical reality, but is purely entries in a ledger, and not even a paper ledger, but an electronic ledger. What if the electronic ledgers vanish? Suddenly we've got no idea who's got what. And then getting your toilet to work, well, you'll get one flush because it's got water in the system, and you might get a couple of flushes because somewhere in your local area there's a tower where water runs downhill by gravity. But once that tower runs out, after half a day or so, there's no electricity to pump the water in. And so you can go for 2 or 3 days without water, and then you're gone, man. Food, the world record's about 54 weeks if you start off obese. A couple of 100 kilograms. But, that was a guy who lost. No. So that for me is a really scary thing. But hopefully we'll skirt through that, as we will hopefully skirt through climate change and other things.
Now, as I recall, you have a water collection system at your house, don't you? A rainwater collection?
Yeah, I've got a 50,000 litre, 50-ton underground water tank, and it goes through a whole bunch of successively finer filters. And the last one going in is a 100 micron filter. 70 microns, about the thickness of a human hair. And that catches a lot of dirt. And then on the way out, it needs an electric pump to make it work. But you can go and dip a bucket in a well, and it goes through a 15 micron filter, and then through ultraviolet. But in an emergency, I'd be just happy to drink it. It's amazing though, when we've had a few days of rain, and definitely all the dirt off the roof has been washed off.
Yeah.
Each day, I pick up a volume of dirt in the 100 micron filter external to the tank, a volume of dirt equal to a small chicken egg. So that means as the rain falls down from the sky, between the sky and my 100 square meters of roof, there's a chicken egg's worth of dirt in there every 24 hours. Wow, I had no idea that the air was that dirty.
Now, is it true that every raindrop has to form around some sort of piece of dust?
I don't know. I reckon in most cases it has to, but if you force it enough, if you make the concentration gradient of humidity and temperature high enough, it will form without. But in general, you do need a small particle of dust. And this came to me on one of my radio shows when a chippy, now is that an American term that you understand? A chippy?
Chippy? No.
A person who generates lots of chips of wood, a carpenter.
Oh, so no, I never would have guessed that.
A sparky is an electrician. You got that one? Is that what American term?
That either.
For most things, we Australians are very lazy. We simply chop off everything except the first syllable, then add a vowel to it. So a fire officer is a fiery, an ambulance officer is an ambo, and so it goes. Anyway, So this chippy rang in and said, I've been sanding with some incredibly fine paper, about 4,000. I didn't know it went that high, 4,000 little grains per inch. And he said, it's a really hot day, but when I breathe out through the cloud of dust, suddenly little water droplets form. And that was a classic case of nucleation centers. So that's the beauty of having a question and answer session, because people ring in with stuff that they want to know about, as opposed to me coming to the chippy and saying, now stop drinking this alcoholic beer with your friends and listen to my dissertation on nucleation centers. No way. But the other way around, he wants to know.
You mentioned the chippy called in on the radio show, right?
Yeah.
So what are this is the kind of the thing I wanted to get around to asking you. What are people calling in about a lot these days? Are you seeing any trends in unscientific beliefs that people are calling in to ask you about?
Oh, yes. There's still people ringing in about the alkaline diet and A2 milk. But mostly it's things in their daily lives like the timber, or how come when they get the belly button fluff, that one still pops up from time to time, or
Wait,
how
what
come
is that question? Belly button
how,
fluff.
how come they get belly button fluff arising in their belly button? Where does it come from?
Oh, where's okay.
Yep. Yeah. And how come when they go out in the sunlight, suddenly they'll start sneezing? So a lot of them are down home questions, or when they're driving in the car and one of the kids in the back drops down one of the windows, suddenly they get this pain in their ears. Okay, so it's sort of all down home questions. But we do get, when we try and we have famous people in with expertise in certain areas, we get lots of questions related to that. So we had a woman who runs the only body farm in Australia. A body farm being where you get a bunch of bodies and you leave them out in the open for days and weeks to see what happens to them. And this is for helping people doing forensic analysis of crime scenes, but also for knowledge for us of what happens to a dead body. And by the way, and during her show, this was so funny. She's a Norwegian person and she couldn't study forensic science in Norway. Okay, question without notice. Why couldn't she study forensic science in Norway?
I don't know. It's too cold. I don't know why.
The crime rate is so low.
Oh, I was thinking the refrigeration of the dead bodies and they don't deteriorate. But no, that's.
But isn't that astonishing? I had no idea. And so I was in Iceland a while ago, and they showed me this building, and they said, "Oh, that used to be our women's prison, but we had to shut it down because there weren't enough women committing crimes."
Yeah.
So what they have in that part of the world is an inclusive society where you pay lots of tax, and in return you are covered cradle to grave.
Yeah.
And speeding fines are proportional to your income.
Right.
So a wealthy Norwegian got a speeding fine of several $100,000.
I remember that. That was big news. Yeah.
yeah. And so the follow on from that is that everybody's happy. And everybody can get an education because that's for free, and the crime rate is so low that to study her forensic science she had to go to Canada to do it. Anyway, so that when we had her on the Triple J show, people rang in from around the world. By the way, just so you know, if you go to drkarl.com, drkarl.com, it's got all my radio shows and how you can ring in from around the world, including a BBC show. That's fun as well.
You said you're doing 8 shows now? Is that 8 regular weekly shows?
Yeah, so there's Townsville, Cairns, Brisbane, Triple J, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, BBC, Western Victoria, and then there's always more just sort of popping in when people want to have an answer to something scientific. So they're half-hour or 1-hour shows, and some of them are every 2 weeks, but it works out to, on average, 8 radio shows around Australia and the world where people ring in questions. And earlier this year, I set a really obscure record, and you'd wonder why anybody would even bother. And I now hold the record for the first series of radio talkback shows from Antarctica.
I'm surprised that they would have good internet in Antarctica.
It's essential. I was chewing up most of it. So in the Casey base station, they had about 5 megabits a second, and they gave me, I think 5 megabits a second, and they gave me about 3 or 4 of that for video, and because I needed to see the face of the person I'm working with so I can interact, and then only about 125K for audio, and that was just for a few of the shows. So I chewed up a lot of the bandwidth going into Casey. And I'll tell you something amazing. I bet you never knew this. In Antarctica, in a blizzard, going horizontally, there's a wind up to 180 kilometers an hour hitting you. But if you look straight up, you can see a blue sky. In a blizzard, where you can't see horizontally, and you've got a bit of a whiteout, maybe 10, 20 meters, 5 meters, depending, you can look up and see a blue sky if you're on a little bit of a rise. So the snow stays really close to the ground.
Oh.
And by the way, I didn't know this either. Around Antarctica, you've got half a dozen hurricanes or cyclones going all the time.
Really?
Yeah. So I think it's because for them to work, they've got to have a temperature difference. And the temperature difference is between the ocean, which is minus 1.8 degrees, and then inland, which is about 20 or 30. And that energy difference is the energy supply for the hurricane. And so you've got half a dozen of them going around in a clockwise direction, because it's this side of the equator, not your side, and each of them rotating clockwise. And when they kiss onto Antarctica, you get a blizzard. When they kiss onto the other countries like Australia, you get a cold front. Anyway, that was my big surprise. During a blizzard, you can actually see a blue sky above you. Man, that was wild.
So then it would, at the north, you would not have those blizzards at the North Pole, right? Because there's no landmass up there?
Ooh. Well, like politics, weather is local. That's to buy me time to think. And then now that I've been able to think, the answer is I don't know. Speculate that you wouldn't get that same sort of blizzard like in a total whiteout. So some of the people there had to do overland transits of 1,200 kilometres, going flat out in these big, huge diesel tractors on rubber treads, and doing 100 kilometres a day, driving flat out for 12 and a half hours. And then when they come, then 2 hours to wind down at the end of the day and 2 hours to start up. And why do you think 2 hours to start up? Well, when they open the cabin of the tractor, inside, thanks to the blizzard, there's about 100 kilograms of ice, which they've got to chip out and get off all the instrument panels and then start up again. And they were describing to me how sometimes when they're towing a caravan of 200 tons, and so you've got three of these giant Caterpillar Challenger tractors sort of churning away flat out, going chugga, chugga, chugga. Sometimes when you've got the lead tractor skimming the ice, because you've got all these sastrugi, which are bumps going up and down, and you've got to skim off the mountains and dump them into the valleys. Sometimes they can have the engine roaring. They can hear the engine roaring, and they can just barely see the rubber tractor treads going around, but they can't see anything else. And when they look at the GPS, they're not moving. The blade has gone too deep, and they're stuck in the ice, and they're just scraping on the ice, and then they have to call halt. And it's amazing conditions down there. I actually slept on the ice one night, and I woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning feeling cold. I thought, why am I cold? I suddenly realized I'm sleeping on a tiny sheepskin about a centimetre or half an inch thick, and then a sleeping bag, and underneath that is 50 metres of ice there. And inside the air is colder than the inside of a freezer. Oh, that's why I'm cold, right. And when I woke up in the morning, I wanted to have a drink, and the water bottle was frozen. And when I mentioned this to my other colleagues, they said, oh, come on, you didn't put it in your sleeping bag, trick for young players. I didn't pick that one. And it took me about 15 minutes to put on my shoes because my hands were so cold and everything was cold. And I was almost in tears at the end of it, thinking, I can't even get on my shoes. What has happened to me? Have I become so decrepit I can't even put on my shoes?
I hate this, but we're out of time.
Well, it's been so much fun talking with you again, Brian. I look up to running into you in physical person and getting you on my radio shows next time you come to Australia.